Welcome to the 7th International Writers Festival here in Mishkenot Sha'ananim, Jerusalem. My name is Moti Schwartz, and I'm heading this wonderful place, and I'm very happy to welcome you all. Indeed, we haven't seen it all, right? That's the name of the panel. On one hand, it's a regular phrase, one that holds hope in it. As to what we can expect ahead of us, it is always optimistic to look forward to new challenges and interests. On the other hand, taking in consideration what we are going through these days in Israel, and in fact all over the world, maybe it is not so promising. This beginning being the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, if I may, in this time our role is important, maybe more than ever, by creating culture and enabling this stage for different voices. We keep the possibility of open discussion, which is so vital for the writers and creators we are hosting in this festival. Our guests tonight are exceptional. Sjon is a multi-talented Icelandic poet, novelist, and lyricist, and much more about we may hear later this evening. His writing is less known to us here yet. I think we can say it is real discovery now that we can read his first book translated to Hebrew, Tzilo Shel Baldor, thanks to Locus Publishing House. After Margaret Atwood and David Mitchell, Sjon is the third contributor to the international project The Future Library. Sjon is also a guest of one of the unique residency programs we host here in collaboration with our colleagues in Venice. He just returned from there and plans to stay with us later this year, so welcome, Sjon. Not a bad combination to spend some time here and there. I really don't think I need to introduce David Grossman here or anywhere in the world. Recipient of the International Man Booker Prize, the Israel Prize, and many more. Hopefully, at least one more to come. His new book, Life Plays With Me, had just been released and immediately become a must-read. Friend of Mishkenot, a true Israeli patriot, and a genuine voice we all hope will keep leading us and be heard. Our moderator, Professor Evan Fallenberg, is a writer, translator, professor at Bar-Ilan University and many more institutes globally. He is the artistic director of in the International Translators Residency Program, which will mark this summer 20 years since the iconic Israeli playwright Hanoch Levin passed away, together with his translators from all over the world. Most important, he is a boutique hotel owner. So that makes him the perfect choice to lead us to the conversation today. I want to welcome Sjon, David Grossman, and Evan Fallenberg.
Thank you, Moti. And I think it's fair to say that I keep coming back here. Well, I'm invited, so I really appreciate that. But I keep coming back because of you and your team. This amazing group of people that managed to make every event an event. And it's very exciting to be back here. I won't name names, but one name I will say, Liran Golod, who's the artistic director, and today is her birthday. So are you here, Liran? Well, we'll sing to her later when she shows up. It's really very exciting. Yes. Okay, one more time. Wave so everybody can see you back there. Thank you. Happy birthday. It's very, very exciting to be here on the stage with these two fine, interesting, intelligent, accomplished gentlemen. And I think maybe the best way for you to meet them is through their own language first before we go to English. And I've asked them each to read a very short passage in Hebrew and in Icelandic for you to just hear the way the two languages sound. I'll read the English translations of those short passages, and then we'll start with some discussion. So, Sjon, would you begin, please? And this is from, let me just show you, this is the new book that has just been published It's a beautiful, beautiful book, I have to say, and his publisher is right here in front of me. And so you can get it in Hebrew, and the English version is called The Blue Fox. And you are going to be reading right from the beginning of the book, right?
Yes, I will read the very first page. There are a few pages and not much on them. But let me first say thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Evan, for hosting this conversation. And David, I'm really honored to be with you on stage. After all those years, I first saw David on television. I was living in Holland 30 years ago, 1989, 90, in the spring of 90. I saw David on the television, and I went straight out to the bookstore the day after and ordered 2 books, Sea Under Love and The Yellow Wind. So for me, it's an amazing journey from that television screen in a small room in Maastricht to the stage here with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mórauðar tógur eru svo undurlíkar steinum að furðu sætir. Þegar þær liggja við þá á vetrum vonlaust að greina þær frá sjálfu grjótinu, já mun snúnara en þessar hvítu sem alltaf skuggar í eða gulkar fyrir á hjarninu. Mórauð tóa liggur sem fastast við steinin sinn og lætur skafa yfir sig veðurmegin. Hún snýr rassinum í vindin, hringar sig saman og stingur nefi undir lær. Lygnir aftur augum svo rétt matar í augasteinin. En þannig fylgist hún með manninum sem hefur ekki haggast frá þeirri stundu að hann lagðist undir hengjuna hér í efstu hlíðum Ásheima fyrir 18 tímum. Það hefur fokið yfir hann og snjóað, svo nú hann engu líkur nema tóftarbroti. Og dýrið verður að gæta þess að gleyma því ekki að hann veiðimaður.
Blue foxes are so curiously like stones that it is a matter for wonder. When they lie beside them in winter, there is no hope of telling them apart from the rock themselves. Indeed, they're far trickier than white foxes, which always cast a shadow or look yellow against the snow. A blue vixen lies tight against her stone, letting the snow drift over her on the windward side. She turns her rump to the weather, curls up, and pokes her snout under her thigh, lowering her eyelids till there's the merest hint of a pupil. And so she keeps an eye on the man who has not shifted since he took cover under the overhanging drift, here on the upper slopes of Ausheimar, some 18 hours ago. The snow has drifted and fallen over him until he resembles nothing so much as a hump of ruined wall. The creature must take care not to forget that the man is a hunter. And that translation is by Victoria Cribb, who is your English translator. David, a new book. Can you show it to the audience, please? They haven't maybe seen it yet.
איתי החיים משחק הרבה. Sjon, thank you for what you said about me. And I just got to know you a week ago through your first book that was translated to Hebrew, The Shadow of Balduz, it's called in Hebrew, the Blue Fox in English, which sounds much more attractive, I think. And it's a stunning book, really very small text, and yet it is so charged and with so many layers that some of them I discovered only on the second read. And the relationship between the people are so extreme, yet are held back with such a power of refraining from, surrendering to all those energies. I really highly recommend it. I was deeply moved by reading it, and I do not say just as two writers that are forced almost to compliment each other on stage. I really mean it.
And David, if I may just give a compliment here, the translator is here with us, and this is the first book that's been translated directly from Icelandic to Hebrew. So Moshe Erlander Okon is back in the corner. Congratulations to you too.
Kol hakavod, yeah. So I'll read some lines from my latest novel, told by Gili. She's a 39 years old woman, and she talks about her mother who has abandoned her when she was 3.5 years old. היא לופתת אותי, האישה הזאת, שלפני 36 שנים חתכה אותי מהחיים שלה. עשתה הפלה, אשכרה הפילה אותי. אמנם באיחור חינני של 3.5 שנים, כי הרי כבר הייתי, ילדה די חמודה לפי כמה עדויות ולפי התמונות, וזאת הלכה וגרדה אותי מתוכה. ועכשיו היא תוקעת את הראש שלה בצוואר שלי, ואני, במקום להעיף אותה לאלף עזאזל, אני לא זזה. ודרך אגב, היא קלה פחד, ככה אני מגלה. מסתבר שלא רק לב אין לה, אלא כנראה חסרים גם שאר האיברים הפנימיים. ולחשוב כמה טונות היא שקלה כשלא הייתה.
Life plays with me. She grips me, this woman who 36 years ago cut me out of her life, had an abortion, actually aborted me, even if she did so a fashionable 3.5 years late, because by then I already existed. Poor Gili had been born, and was a pretty cute girl by some accounts and judging by the pictures. And this woman went and scraped me out of her, and now she shoves her head onto my neck, and me, instead of telling her to go to hell, I don't move. And by the way, she's horribly light, as I discover. It turns out that not only does she have no heart, but her other internal organs seem to be missing too. And just to think how many tons she weighed when she was gone. Translation by Jessica Cohen. So, in the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Less by Andrew Sean Greer, the main character, the protagonist, Les, is invited to interview a very famous writer. And I went back, I remember that scene, I went back to see how it was handled, and the narrator writes, and yet, what is there to ask him? What does one ever ask an author except, how? And the answer, as Les well knows, is obvious. Beats me. So this could be a very short conversation, but I won't ask the question how, and you won't just say beats me. But I would like to start with the fact that you are, and as was published in the program here, both from small language countries, what are we calling them now? Languages spoken by not many people. That's the new definition. And from very special and specific cultures. So, an Icelandic writer, an Israeli writer. I could argue that each of you is the most prominent writer of your generation in your nation, and maybe the voice most looked to from outside the nation. So, a couple of questions about that, and I invite you each to address them as you see fit and what's comfortable for you. Do you feel that you represent your country as you travel around the world as a writer? Do you feel a need or a lack of permission to criticize the country you come from? And what do you think, in your mind, is unique about writing in Hebrew, writing in Icelandic, writing about Israel, writing about Iceland? David, would you start off?
So many questions. I don't feel I represent anyone but myself, and even that is quite dubious for me. I talk when I'm asked, and I am asked, about life in Israel, about the situation, and I try to portray it as fair as possible. And of course, the only difference between what I say here in Israel and what I say out of Israel is that when I speak out, I explain more, because most of the facts are not known to people, and they are quite prone to have prejudices, and this I try to balance or to fix. Yes, I and Sjon, we come from very small languages. The people who can read us in the origin are not very much. And yet there is this strange magic that people are reading our books, and we are very lucky for that and thankful for that, I think. And they feel that it belongs to them, that it tells them something that they know from their own life. And it always amazes me that I get responses from places that I have never been to, and they say, you wrote about my life. I remember after the book of intimate grammar, so many people wrote to me that they could identify with this little Jerusalemite symbiotic family, and that it's the same for them, they said. And I thought that after all, in a generalization, but we all come from small places. You know, even the most important people in the most important television net, they all, in the end, we all come from very small places and small or tight families, so they can understand what we are talking about. And I think that the reason why certain books, they travel well in translation is that because they keep intuitively a kind of mixture of the intimate and the exotic, the familiar and the unfamiliar, to the extent that it can arouse some attraction to know more or to decode more. I will, excuse me, I will repeat here something that I told when I met an hour ago with my publishers here, but I think it says everything. And I keep telling this little story as a homage to my father, that when I was writing the book of intimate grammar about this little Jerusalemite family that resembles quite a lot my own family. And when I gave it to my father to read before the book was published, he said, it's a very nice book, but do you think that someone out of our family can understand it? And I thought it's a wonderful question, because it tells me everything. You know, I want to be translated. I like to be read by people in far remote places that I never was there, and I probably will never be. But at the same time, I want my father always to ask this question: can someone out of our family can understand it?
Yes, I relate very much to what you said, and it was actually quite liberating for me when I wrote this novel, The Shadow of Baldur, or The Blue Fox, because I tried to write the most Icelandic book possible. And I remember saying to my publisher when I handed in the manuscript, I said, this one we will not try to sell abroad. It is too local. And he said, you're absolutely right. But you know, for some reason, I asked Victoria Cribb to translate it anyway, just to give friends as a Christmas present, English friends or friends who do not speak Icelandic. And the lesson to me was that this was the book that made it out into the world and has now been translated to 35 languages. The most Icelandic book ever written, possibly. We all come from places, and I think one of the fundamental needs of the human being is to share stories from their places and from their people. And this is what makes it possible for an Icelander to see himself in a story told from a small community in Israel, and vice versa, I think. It is because we love to hear stories about ourselves. We like to hear how people do the same things that we do, but differently. In cinema, you see it all the time. If you see a funeral in cinema, it doesn't matter in what culture it takes place. We all know the emotions that are going on in that situation. But it is only through translation that those stories travel. And when it comes to the question of languages, in Iceland, we have stopped talking about big languages and small languages. We talk about languages spoken by many or languages spoken by few. Because it is possible that a language spoken by few, like the Icelandic, can actually accommodate literature from the formerly called big languages. So if it's possible to translate Dante into Icelandic, it means that the Icelandic language is big enough for Dante. So it's not about size. And when we talk about size, we are automatically in the world of hierarchy. So we should stop that. This is a request from the former Icelandic president, Vigdis
Yes.
Finnbogadóttir.
Yes, I know.
She told me at a meeting that I should stop doing this, and I've stopped doing it, and now I'm spreading the word. But Icelandic is a language spoken today by 350,000 people. So it is much smaller than a smaller group than of people than speak the Hebrew language. But what we have is that we have a language that has been used as a literary language for 1,000 years, and that must bring something to it as well. So in Iceland we are quite confident about this language. We are confident that when we write today, that we are bringing into our contemporary writing echoes from the great medieval literature, for example. And of course, we never know how much of that translates, but it would not be possible to write the contemporary text without the great river flowing through us. But I am here as an Icelandic writer. I do not represent my country. I do not have any license from the government to do that. I represent myself as an author. But of course, I'm always in the situation that I can't help being the Icelander in the room.
I think we were talking before about the resonances in the language, and certainly both Icelandic and this audience knows how well the Jewish texts resonate in the Hebrew language that David uses every day in speaking, but certainly in his writing. And both of you had some very interesting things to say about the process of translation, and wondering, with all of that, the cultural background and the nuances of language, how do your books go out into the world, and how do you understand that people understand them in their new languages?
Actually, we do not really know, and it's a mystery, and we were talking about it before. I write a sentence in Hebrew that somehow echoes maybe the Bible or other layers of the Hebrew. We have several layers of the Hebrew. And I mix them with the last updated slang, and I enjoy the game between the two. Now, what comes across when this is translated? In Hebrew, there are so many connotations and associations, like in Icelandic, of course. But this cannot be conveyed through a translation. It will be clumsy. It will not be understood. It will be like to explain a joke. Yes, you cannot do it. So really the question, what is this mysterious thing that goes through translation? Because we all grew up on translations. And we learned about remote places and remote people through translation. So it cannot be that the translation conveys only the backbone of the fish. Yeah, it has to convey the whole fish, the whole body of work. And I really do not have an answer for that. I mean, I sometimes sit with my translators, and I trust them to be the best in the world. And I just want to believe that they are able to translate in such a way that radiates something, something that is not, you cannot formulate it. What I did with the last two books, one is A Horse Walks into a Bar and Falling Out of Time, I gathered my translators in a small place in Germany, because there is a center of translation there. It's called Strahlen, a little village on the border with Holland. And we sat there for a whole week, and every day for 10 or sometimes more than that hours, I read to them the book. Chapter, not chapter, sometimes paragraph by paragraph. They all speak Hebrew, of course, they are translators. And then they started to consult amongst themselves regarding difficulties, obstacles, things that cannot be translated. And for a whole week, we were just immersed in this spiritual act, it was something wonderful, really wonderful. I think then I understood how lucky we are, people who are dealing with literature, people who are dealing with art, because in our world that is so vulgar and thick, we are dealing with very precise things. And they taught each other or gave answers to each other in places that were problematic. You know, the Norwegian and the German and the Dutch. And there were all these murmuring of voices trying to find a solution to words. And I think by doing that, maybe I did not explain everything, but at least they got acquainted with the melody through which I hear my own story. And the melody is 90% of the whole thing. I think literature is a lot about music. And yet the question remains, what do we read when we read translation?
Would you like to address that? Because I can go on. David, you gave us a good entree into other arts. And both of you are very adept at that. You're both writers, but you have your fingers in other pies, other arts. And for example, Sjon, he has collaborated on lyrics, working with people like Lars von Trier and Björk. And Moti mentioned that he's involved in the Future Library Project. And I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about that as well. Just to one word of background, it involves a book that Sjon should be writing, that none of us will ever read. No one in this room will ever read, and Sjon will never see it published because it will only be published in 2114, right? Can you tell them about that?
Yes, this is an arts project by a Scottish artist called Patterson. I have already finished my bit. You know, I've already handed in my manuscript, which will be published in 2114. And the idea is to create a library for the future, that those of us who are living today, we start this library, which of course will just grow, and I must say actually that I am quite happy to be one of the first. I thought, you know, if the project had started, let's say 1973, then I would be like quite coming to it quite late. And I would not like to have all the great writers of the 20th century like there in front of me and having to write something.
So far it's
compete.
Margaret Atwood and David Mitchell.
Yeah, I can live with that, you know. They're both very good, but I can live with that. No, but so there is a forest just outside Oslo where they are growing trees that will grow for 100 years. And the trees will then be cut down and used for paper, for making paper that the whole library will be printed on. So this is the future library, and the idea is to introduce a project that makes us think ahead and work together over generations. But about translation and working in different fields, I would just like to say that I think on one level we are always translating ourselves when we write the first and original work of literature. We are trying to translate what is here, and we are engaging with the language that we work in. And I have actually come to feel more and more that the language, in my case the Icelandic language, is a being of its own. It's like an artificial intelligence being that brings with it memories, stories, because it has been used throughout the centuries to translate the human being into a work of literature. So the text is responding. The text responds. And sometimes I'm not sure if I am actually getting the idea or if the language is giving me the idea of how to continue a paragraph or sometimes even, you know, I write something and the language suggests the opposite, and I try it and it looks much better. So I think we are engaging with a being. I think language is a being that we have a conversation with when we are translating ourselves, and maybe if we are good, we push our text pushes the translator into a similar discussion, conversation with his or her own language. And that's maybe why it works. Yeah.
That's stunning. I think we're all stunned. Yes, that's really a beautiful thought.
Yeah, it shows also that translation is partly influenced by the personality of the translator.
Yes.
But also the personality of the language to which he translates, and it has another personality.
I'm thrilled, as a translator, I'm thrilled that they're getting stuck on the translation topic. This is wonderful. But you're also involved in these other arts, and are you still writing lyrics and poetry that's set to music and things like that?
I've written a few librettos. There was the premiere of a new opera in Aix-en-Provence last year, where I wrote a libretto and based it on earlier poems that I had written. It's called Seven Stones. And that's what I was going to say about the relationship between translation and different genres or forms of literature. And that is, that when I write a novel, I am translating myself into a novel. When I write a libretto, I'm translating myself into a libretto. So for me, it's very rewarding to work in different fields. For example, when I wrote this one, I had the Shadow Baldur. I had just come from working with the Brodsky Quartet, the English string quartet. And my work with them provided me with the structure of this book. The book is structured as a Schubert string quartet. No, nobody knows. Nobody knows. But you know it now.
Well, David, you're moving into film, plays, and I think an opera. There's something like that going on. That's what it says in the internet, anyway. So
good to know.
If I'm wrong, this is your chance to correct me.
There is an opera for children based on my story. Itamar meets a rabbit, and Yoni Rechter composed it, and I wrote the lyrics. Yeah, but I thought, yes, to borrow from you your terminology. When I write for children, then I translate myself to a child, and I know in myself, but not only to children. When I write from a point of view of a woman, this tuning yourself to the option of the woman inside you, or the child inside you, or the old man inside you, or the Palestinian, if I write, because this is, after all, this is the heart of writing. I think the way we are able to surrender to others, the way we start to think like in another logic, not our logic, not the logic that we know. But I remember there is a story called Itamar Walks on Walls, Itamar מטייל על הקירות או מטפס על הקירות, and then a little lion runs after a train, and he jumps on a train and he disappears, and his parents are looking for him, and then they see him somewhere there, and they said, "Why did you jump on this train?" And he says, because it has a green locomotive. And I'm very proud of this line, because I think this is exactly how a child will justify something that he did. So and the process of writing is really the struggle of letting go all the stiff muscles of this I, of this self that I have, that you and you have. Yeah, we are so much imprisoned by our I, by ourself. And the writing is such a wonderful way to massage a little this I, and to show us how we became prisoners of it, and to give us the taste, really the sweet taste of being an other. This other can be tormented, can be horrible, can be cruel. And yet, if you totally surrender to this option, if you let go, if you understand that realities consist of so many other different points of view, of experiencing things, of exploring things, of being in this world, then there is this really sweetness reward of suddenly expanding, of suddenly, you can look at yourself, you can look at your narrative. By the way, I hate this word because it's very seldom in the dictionary of the conflict between us and the Palestinians, our narrative, their narrative. I feel that a narrative is a human story that has been congealed or has been frozen, like a stiff muscle. And everything I feel that I try to do while writing is to massage this narrative. It can be between a man and a woman, between a child and his parents, between siblings, between a person in himself. Yeah, but this is the energy of massaging it, to allow suddenly, other ways to be with capital B, because we are talking about, you said before, Sjon, about the power of stories, and stories are our way to keep a sequence of ourselves. These are the stories we tell ourselves. And we forget that every moment consists of so many alternative stories. There are so many particles of possible optional stories that are hovering, even in this room, every person that we see. There are so many layers of exploring this other person, and in every conversation that we have, there are so many occurrences that take place all the time, and it's with the magnitude that we cannot even understand, more than the heat of the sun, yes, the power of these, and we prefer, or we are doomed to narrow down ourselves to only this narrative, and we surrender and we subjugate ourselves to it. But writing can be the rebel, you say, Hamor? Yeah. The rebellion against this narrowing down that we have, that we tend to have, especially if we live in a harsh place, especially if we live all our life in war. There is this instinct to narrow down yourself, to close yourself, to protect yourself from the wealth of reality. And if I may say, excuse me for this long speech, but part of my struggle for peace here, except of all the good and important things that are almost taken for granted for me, that everyone will have his freedom and his future and territory, is the belief that if we are lucky to have some years of peace, maybe we shall be able really to feel more and to be more. It's not that we are not being here, but there is a slight chance that life without a threat and without constant fear of death and without existential danger will allow us really to, as I said, to massage the entrenched and the limited self that we allow ourselves, because we do not really want to be in touch with reality, because this reality is unbearable. The very simple sentence, Israel occupies another people for 52 years, is unbearable. And of course we need to protect ourselves from it. And because of that, for me, being a writer here is so significant, because it allows me, this is my resistance. This is my way to regain what was confiscated from me by the situation.
I think you both gave a beautiful response to the real tragedy of being human beings, and that's that we're trapped inside our own minds and our own souls all the time. And the way you've both dealt with it is leaving them in the form of other people, as characters, and becoming those people that you both do so beautifully in all of your books, really and truly. And we want to spend a little time talking about those books, the newest of them. But first of all, something that brings the two of you together as writers is a respect and admiration of the writer Bruno Schultz. And for those of you who are familiar or not familiar, less familiar with the writings of Bruno Schultz, he was a Polish-Jewish writer born in 1892 in Drohobych, and he wrote in Polish. His oeuvre is very small, basically 2 collections of stories and a lost manuscript that was meant to be a novel called The Messiah. And he was shot in 1942 in the ghetto in his hometown. He really never left there. And both of you have publicly and privately expressed your admiration of him, and also through your writing. And maybe we can just spend a few minutes on that. Sjon, if you could say something about... and I should mention that while we have been talking about The Blue Fox, because that's the first book of Sjon's published in Hebrew, his most recent book is Codex 1962, which is quite a bit bigger than The Blue Fox. And it's actually 3 novels in one: a crime story, a love story, and a science fiction story, all in one. And there's definitely Bruno Schultz in this book.
Well, I was introduced to the work of Bruno Schultz when I was 17, 18. I became, in a way, the disciple of an Icelandic artist called Alfred Flóki. He was our surrealist. He was really a walking encyclopedia on everything strange, hidden, underground in both the visual arts and literature. And we met when I was 17, and he said, well, before we even try to have a proper conversation, there are 3 books you must read. And it was The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. It was The Golem by Gustav Meyrink. And it was The Street of Crocodiles by Bruno Schultz, as it was called in the edition published by Philip Roth in the 70s. So Alfred Flóki had come across Bruno Schultz first, I think, as a visual artist, because Flóki was also dealing in the darker sides of human behavior and sexual eccentricities, let's say, to be polite. And then he had found the book, and he gave me a copy of The Street of Crocodiles. And it became an incredibly important book for me. I mean, it's almost a sacrilege to try to describe the effect of Bruno Schultz on you. I always fail when I try, but I think David succeeded in Sea Under Love, of describing how you go into that world and how Bruno somehow just carries you. It was a great shock to me when Flóki told me what had happened to Bruno, that he had been shot in the street like a dog, and I somehow instinctively understood that not only an individual, a human being, had been lost, but the whole world had gone with him. And I made it my mission, in a way, quite early on, with no means, to bring Bruno Schultz to Iceland. And the first thing that I managed to do was when Théâtre de Complicité came to Iceland with their magnificent staging of his stories. And then I, with the help of other friends who were in love with Bruno Schultz, we managed to get our publisher to publish an Icelandic translation of The Cinnamon Shops. So I don't know where to start. And for me, you know, the fact that Bruno Schultz found his way to Iceland, having been killed so brutally and taken away from life, and life taken away from him, somehow that, for me, became the story of how literature, stories, the human need for sharing their worlds, if we are really hopeful, overcomes the brutality.
Yeah, yeah. I came to know Bruno. By the way, I so much like to look at you because I think this is how I look when I try to explain to people the magic of Bruno Schultz. I published my first novel here. It was called The Smile of the Lamb. Yeah, and Israel is a very democratic place. You know, people will stop you on the street and they will tell you by whom you were inspired, from whom you stole. And I must say that usually when people told me from whom I was inspired or stole from, I went later and read them for the first time, and I saw that my critics were right. You know, because if you write today, there are particles of Kafka, of Virginia Woolf, of Bruno Schultz in the air. And one day a guy called me and he said, I am Daniel Shilit. He worked in the Israeli television. He was born in Poland. He passed away, unfortunately. And he said, of course, you were very much influenced in your novel by Bruno Schultz. Now, until that moment, I never heard the name even of Bruno Schultz, to my ignorance, but it sounded like a compliment, so I agreed immediately. And at that evening, I told the story, this anecdote, at the house of our friends, and they said, we have the book of Bruno. And I started to read, and I was taken the way you were taken. I mean, I discovered a kind of a big literary brother that I can really look up to and learn from. And at the writing of Bruno Schultz, every paragraph is like an explosion of many layers of imagination and fantasy and nightmare and reality and surreality and a dream. And I read it. I read the whole book in something like, I think, 2-3 hours, discovering a new dimension in the world. That was my feeling. And then I got to the epilogue written by Yoram Brunovsky, the translator of some of the stories. Some others were translated by Uri Orlev, who lives not far away from us here. And there was this story, this anecdote that you referred to. Bruno Schultz was the house Jew of a Nazi commander when the Nazis invaded Drohobych. And one day, this Nazi officer, he had an opponent, an enemy, another Nazi commander. And one day when Bruno was on the corner of the streets, Chatsky and Mickiewicz in Drohobych, the enemy saw him, shot him dead, and then came to the employer of Bruno Schultz and told him, I killed your Jew. Very well was the response, now I will kill your Jew. I remember really that I closed the book, I left home, and I walked for some hours like in a fog in Ramat Rachel, not far away from where we lived back then, in Talpiot. And I felt I just don't want to live in a world that allows such monstrous even expressions, not to say way of thinking, way of behaving. I just cannot be here. And then I remember, and I went back and I said to my wife, I want to write a book that will shiver on the shelf, that will have the vitality of 1/1,000,000th of the life of Bruno Schultz. And this was the beginning of Sian de Love. This is how Sian de Love started for me. The need to revenge is a little childish, but well, what's the big deal? I can be childish. Why not to be childish when it comes to such revenge against such horrible things? Later, because many people who are the fans of Bruno wrote to me, I started to gather more and more and more information. And the story is not exactly as it was told. This anecdote that became so famous in the whole world was not really true. I found the person who was really an eyewitness. He saw what happened. He saw, because Bruno Schultz was his teacher in the gymnasium, and he was 16 years old boy who loved Bruno Schultz, who adored him. And he just saw some squads of the Ukrainians shooting Jews randomly, and they shot one person. He didn't know who he is, but after they went, he came to the body because he saw a loaf of bread coming out from the coat. And he turned him to the other side, and he saw the face of his beloved teacher, Bruno Schultz. And I asked this guy, Zeev Fleischer is his name, did you take the loaf of bread? Because they all starved there. And he said, no, of course not. And then some hours later, he called me at home and he said, maybe I just took just a bit of it. And I said, why be ashamed? I think this is exactly what your teacher wanted you to have. He fed you in so many ways. Why not feed you with the loaf?
David, since writing Bruno Schultz in See Under Love, you haven't really taken real characters and made them fiction until now, until this new book, which is, I should just note that it's not out in English yet. So if you're going to look for it immediately after this, you will not find it. It'll be about another year probably. But how did you come back to that? Why now, and why this particular story?
Usually I like to invent characters, and even if I take real characters from life, I try to crossbreed them with other characters. And sometimes, in a funny way, some people recognize themselves in part of the character. and in this case, in Life Plays With Me, I got the story from a lady that rang me up some 23 years ago, and she had something very special to tell me. She scolded me actually for not being tough enough on settlers in one of the essays that I wrote in Haaretz. And she had a foreign accent, and we started to talk, and I immediately realized that she is a story. You know, she has a story to tell, and she herself is a story. And she started to call me every other week, and then we met when she came to visit her friend in Jerusalem. And I started to write her down. I told her that I'm writing her down, and she really wanted that. She was 77 when we met, and she died 4 years ago at the age of 97. And I never heard such a story, I must say. And the story itself is so very strong. And she wanted me to tell the story. And I told her immediately, listen, I am not a documentarist. For that there are other better than me people. I'm a fiction writer. I want to document and to imagine you. And she accepted the idea. And I'm not going to tell the story here, and I think we are running out of time. We are falling out of time. But it is a story about something that happened to her, that she has to made a terrible decision, like Sophie's choice decision, in a way not less cruel than that. And she made her choice, and by that she created a kind of a tragedy for 3 generations. I mean, for her, for her daughter, and for her granddaughter. And the book is about all the relationship between these very strong women, and a journey they all made into the island, the Gulag, the Yugoslavian Gulag. It is called Goli Otok, the naked island. And in this place they retold the story of the family. And I think, you know, when you tell a story, and sometimes you tell it again and again and again in the same words, you do not listen to it, and you do not really tell a story. You just declamate, you quote yourself. But if you are lucky, and there are very attentive ears and eyes, and if you yourself are willing to tell the story in a new way, in a new tuning of yourself to it, suddenly you find another story. And this other story enables you maybe to go again through the tragedy and to suffer for every minute you are in the tragedy, and yet there can be a grace in the end of it. You can suddenly understand things you were unable to understand. You can understand, for example, that also mama has the right to have a psychology. You know, our parents, they can benefit from some mercy from us when we come to judge them. And the story is about these 3 generations, this journey. And as you said, it's the first time, except for Bruno, but Bruno Schultz was for me a kind of a legend. It was not a real concrete story, a character. And they are real and concrete characters. It's not easy to write about real and concrete characters, because when you write a character, you have to be cruel to it also. Every one of us deserves some cruelty. And the thing is how you do it. I can only say from my experience, when I wrote about people that recognize themselves partly, or when I wrote about my family, it was only a way for them, and they accepted it as an opportunity, almost as a privilege to be looked at from another point of view that they were unable to look at themselves. And if you write about a character fully, wholly, you never make a caricature. If you make a caricature, you are in the wrong profession. You should be a good caricaturist, but not a writer. If you are a writer, you must, in the end, understand almost every cell of the character that you write.
This has really been the message this evening. To anybody out there dying to write a novel, I think you've heard it here from both of our guests, the importance of the depth of understanding of the characters. There's no way really of taking your 500, 600-page novel and putting you on the spot now and making you explain it. So I'll just tell everyone here, I mentioned that it's 3 novels in one. It's a mix of any kind of genre you could imagine. It's got tricks and sleights of hand. It's an absolutely riveting read, and this is coming from someone who's allergic to long novels. It's really worth the effort, and you won't be sorry if you try it. So that's the way I'm summing it up. And I don't know about all of you, but I feel like this passed in about 15 minutes, and I wish we could stay for another hour with these two magnificent writers and magnificent people, and I thank you both for being here this evening.